All right, well, this is a wonderful occasion when the centre staff are in Brisbane for a week, and our primary purpose in being in Brisbane this week is to welcome Dr. Andrew Frost, who is joining the lecturing team, and I have Silke, Dr. Silke Meyer with me as well today, and our purpose this week is to work with Andrew around the final preparations for the men's behaviour change, which is going through a CQU approvals process as we speak. So we're going to have a little chat today with Andrew and Silke, just to talk about their research interests and the way in which their research intersects with the centre's research program and with their teaching. So there are sort of three areas of activity that we'll cover today, and we'll look at how those elements work together. So perhaps we start with you, Andrew, since we are you're our primary focus today.
Can I just say, we've got this fantastic view on the 39th floor in front of us, and so if we get distracted in terms of looking at the view from time to time, that's what it's about. But it's a lovely backdrop, isn't it?
Well, that's true. So, Andrew, you started full-time with CQU this week, is that right?
My very first day on Monday. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to talk a little bit about where you've come from and the research and perhaps its relevance to teaching in your prior experience and what you're bringing with you?
Okay. Well, kia ora, Annabel. Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. It's great to be here. It's wonderful to be here. I'm really enjoying Brisbane. A city with real buildings coming from Christchurch, where it's not quite so tall at the moment. And it's great to be part of the team here. It's really exciting stuff, and I feel kind of a heartfelt commitment to the whole project. It's great. My background, I started, go back a wee bit, I started my career in teaching, and I enjoyed teaching, but I didn't like schools very much, and I got into residential social work, working with young males. So it was a residential program, and realised that a lot of the young men I was working with had been abused themselves. They weren't in the residence because of that. They were there ostensibly because they were educationally disadvantaged. But it was clear that they were suffering from a lot of the experiences of abuse. And so, as somebody once sagely said, you get tired of pulling the bodies out of the river and you look upstream to see who's pushing them in. And I got to work with adult men, sexual abusers, men who'd engaged in sexual abuse, in a prison-based program in the context of a therapeutic community. And so...
which was just pioneering for its time. So this was a therapeutic community within a larger men's prison in New Zealand, and was pioneering in New Zealand at that time.
That's right. Yeah. It was a specialist unit. All the men in the unit were clients of the program. So this was a program based on psychological principles, also psychotherapeutic group work, and within the context of this therapeutic community. So the 60-bed unit was a standard medium security unit, and so we had the opportunity there to work with the connections between people, the environment, and the kind of values that underlay this community. So that was the idea of it, and that was really enjoyed. That was there for some 12 and a half years before taking an academic position. Did my PhD research there.
Perhaps just before we move to that, and I'm going to keep interrupting.
Sure, do. Yeah.
With lots of questions.
Yeah.
But our listeners might be interested in just coming back to the therapeutic program in the treatment facility. And given the wider concerns about sexual assault and ongoing concerns, Do you want to make any comment around the efficacy, the effectiveness, what some of the results were from the program?
Yeah, one of the big projects, research projects, looked to compare a cohort of men who had been through the program with and compare them with a matched set of men who would have been eligible for the program prior to its establishment, but didn't go through it. So we compare the reconviction outcomes. So that's not a perfect measure, but it gives you a pretty good steer on what's happening. And what we found was, using a kind of statistical extrapolation, was that over 10 years, 20% of the men who had not undertaken the program were reconvicted. And over the same period, those who had been through the program were reconvicted at a rate of 8 to 10%. So that's about as good as it gets in this business.
Yes,
So that was very promising, always trying to do better, and I think we did do better eventually too. But so that was very encouraging, and I think a lot of it was down to this notion that these men went through a 9-month program. They were immersed in a community that was based on values of respect and openness and directness and honesty, in contradistinction to the usual kind of inmate code that pervades those kind of communities. So for me, research in this field, and the field that I work in is a field, the field of abuse and violence, the idea of research is to answer questions about everyday practice, I believe. That's essentially what it's about. And what that means in this business is reconnecting people with each other and their environments, and to live safe and responsible and respective lives through responsible relationships. And so the whole therapeutic community idea was based on building respectful relationships. And that went from the custodial staff, the therapeutic staff, the inmates themselves, and the education staff, the medical staff, were all engaged in this community. And the idea was like I say, respectful relationships, where the custodial officers actually started referring to the men by their first names. They had these conversations. And so, for me, research is about reconnecting people, because I believe people are born into a context. I think we've all got the opportunity for well-being, for good connections. That gets disrupted in people's lives in various ways. People get detached from those attachment possibilities, and from a Māori perspective, a New Zealand Māori perspective, this is called a hauora. You're born into a web of well-being, and somehow that gets trampled upon. And the idea of research, I think, is looking how people can reconnect to live safe, responsible lives in the context of responsible relationships.
In that particular sort of field of practice.
Yeah.
So I interrupted you, but it's interesting because, of course, the context here is this much stronger focus on perpetrator interventions,
sure.
And I'm sure perhaps those listening will be making some connections in terms of the kinds of interventions which may be supported in Queensland as we move forward to developing much greater capacity in this space. But I interrupted you. Were going to move on to talking about how you moved out of the out of the facility, and then you moved into academia.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I continued my interest really, and I guess in the general field of abuse, and I think the focus for me is we're not working with the enemy isn't the abuser. The enemy is the contagion of violence and abuse, which I think is a contagion. I think we often look at abusers as monsters. I think we've got to get away from looking at monsters to looking at the contagion that passes between people. We know this passes from generation to generation, within generations, and it's bolstered by these notions of masculinity, old blueprints for masculinity. I think that we need to challenge and move away from the disrespect that infuses them.
Yeah. So you've been teaching at the University of Canterbury for some time, and you completed a PhD in this area with treatment of sex offenders. And now you've arrived in Queensland, and we are launching a men's behaviour change program. So do you want to talk a little bit about how your research, and feel free to introduce any other research that you've undertaken as well, but how that is informing your development of the program and how you think you might be sort of introducing some of that as you work your way through it.
Sure. Well, I think my primary focus, I suppose, is engagement, and one of the biggest issues that we face, I think, in this field is that is the degree to which the men we work with, particularly in this field, engage or don't engage with processes of change, and I think that will continue to be an interest of mine, developing stories about how people do change. So, for instance, one of the pieces of research I was involved with in New Zealand was ways of using the therapeutic community. So men would come into the program with various concerns and issues about why they should be involved in a program. They would generally kind of come up with all sorts of reasons why they shouldn't undertake it. Resistant, that's right. So initially I got into a conversation with them, well, we were just butting heads, you know. For every reason they could come up with, that I could come up with why they should do the program, they said no, because of this. And eventually we started collecting the stories of these men, not at the beginning, but at the end of the program. So they would say, I would sit down, interview them, ask them their permission to record this conversation about how they overcame those obstacles, those hindrances through the course of the program. What happened? How did they advise themselves differently? What they came up against, how they overcome those. And use those recordings, again, got the permission of the men to use those recordings for new men coming into the program. So I didn't have to get into this head-butting conversation with them. And I could just say, look, go and have a listen to this conversation I had with John, and then come back and we'll talk some more. And that meant that the men who had gone through the program were leaving something behind of value. They were eager to do so, and that gave them a sense that, you know, put on the mantle of the expert and the cloak of wisdom for them, which I think encouraged them, and that brought a cohesive community together. So collecting stories of success, of reconnecting, as I started off saying. And that's an area I'd like to develop in this work. I think we often don't succeed. We know that men who don't go through change processes, you know, the intervention programs, men behaviour change and so on, they don't complete or they don't attend, and we know the outcomes for those men are much worse in terms of going on to re-abuse. And so one of the key focus, I think, is keeping them in such a program through processes and interventions like that. Yeah.
So that's a really nice little illustration of the value of what was a relatively simple piece of research, but very useful in creating a useful tool in supporting the men and understanding why they were there and why they needed to. So in terms of the men's behaviour change program that you've been working on here, just in development, how have those ideas about engaging reluctant and resistant perpetrators informed what you're doing, what you're building into?
Sure. Well, I'm keen to keep a close relationship with research and practice, and that iterative relationship that those things have. So I guess one of the things I'm keen to work on is not just an understanding of the big picture, in terms of, you know, the Duluth model, various intervention or various theories that inform men's behaviour change, not just the big picture, but what happens actually in the here and now of programs, the immediacy. The kind of visceral experiences that men have in experiencing the programs with each other and through group work, and in their relationships with the practitioners in the program. I guess it's focusing on what happens in those situations, how to make the best use of the processes and the dynamics that go on in those. I'm keen to to focus on that. So it's kind of, it's looking at the different levels of reconnection and so relationships between the men themselves, the clients of various programs, but also relationships between staff members and that relational base that people have, which become models for that healthy connectedness.
Yeah. Great. Well, look, it might be timely to introduce Silke at this point, because we just covered your research experience, Andrew, and how that's informing what you're aiming to do with the program. And I recall, Silke, you and I having a chat the other day, and you were saying that you were just covering the legislation and the domestic and family violence practice grad cert, and that in doing all the legislative material, it was very interesting and helpful, for
Yes.
you. Yeah. But would you like to talk a little bit too about, because you've been in teaching in the program now for some months, and in that time, no doubt, as it's evolved, you've come across the ways in which that interplay between your own research and what you're covering in the course, or encountering in the course, should I say? Yeah.
Yes.
Some thoughts about that?
Yes. So my research background is primarily around help seeking of female victims of domestic and family violence, and the role children play in the help seeking process, also the impact that domestic and family violence has on children's well-being and development throughout the abusive relationship, but also post-separation, the impact it has on the parent-child relationship. So it's fitted in nicely with the courses that we're offering. So it's been a really exciting opportunity to actually connect my research with teaching material. I think also because the research focus of my past projects has always been very practice focused, very grassroots focused, always had consultations with practitioners on the ground to kind of have that exchange of what's the need on the ground, how can we inform that, and it always in the end came back to the role of training, the role of knowledge of practitioners on the ground in various areas, whether that's the specialized victim support services or the law enforcement services, health professionals, everybody really who either by default because they're specialist victim support service or because they are generalist service that just happen to come across victims of domestic and family violence really on a daily basis in their practice. It's always kind of come back to how we can better inform and equip and skill up practitioners on the ground to have that understanding of the complexities associated with domestic and family violence, that there's really no one-size-fits-all approach, that it's never black and white, it's never clear cut. So it's been an exciting opportunity kind of bringing that from some of my projects around mothers help seeking, the experiences of Indigenous women as opposed to non-Indigenous women, the experiences of victims in regional and rural communities as opposed to metropolitan areas where we have a fairly high service density, and bring that into our first two introductory courses around the nature and prevalence of domestic and family violence, and then also interventions, responses, prevention models. And I think it's been really exciting because the majority of the students are practitioners on the ground, and having that frequent interaction of being able to bring in research evidence, in general, the broader research evidence nationally and internationally, but also having my research experience of what it's like engaging with services and victims and perpetrators on the ground in real life scenarios and intervention programs, and being able to kind of bounce experiences back and forth with students in the tutorial discussions, for example. And I think it's been great for me to always have these practitioner experiences and see that a lot of the stuff I see in my research is exactly what they encounter on the ground, and a lot of the implications that have come out of my research are useful for their everyday practice on the ground. And I think some of the feedback from the students has been that it's been great for them to see that what they experience in everyday practice, and I think what for them often is anecdotal evidence, because it's their very narrow, limited experience within their agency, that they've often said it's nice to see this validated from a research perspective, like from a, having a face to that paper that's being published somewhere, and having that opportunity to actually discuss with the researcher, directly the challenges of the research, the implications it then actually has for different kind of practice settings or organizational settings. So I think it's been a two-way interesting development of these courses.
It's an iterative thing, isn't it? It really is.
Yeah.
And I guess part of our job really is to bring those concepts and look at what they look like at the ground, the ground level, at the level of practice.
Yes.
Interpret those concepts, because the two things do work together very much. That's really interesting.
And I think the other exciting opportunity has been that it's really tailored from what we've offered so far and what we're now continuing to offer with you on board, is that it really tailors for so many different areas of practice, government and non-government, and I think between the two of us, having done research with government organizations like child safety, policing, corrections, probation and parole, but also a variety of NGOs working with perpetrators, working with victims, working with children, that really our courses cater for a broad range of practitioners. So it's, it's not narrowed down to specialist experiences of practitioners constantly having victims or victims and children as their everyday focus, but also the broader generalist services out there that have a general mandate around law enforcement or child protection, for example, but come across a large volume of victims and or perpetrators in their everyday practice.
We've got to see ourselves as part of a system, haven't we? A system of accountability, a system of well-being.
I guess just in listening to you in regard to your experience with victims, research with victims, are there any particular experiences that you can recall that have gone on to inform your research and then inform the teaching and what you've been able to share with the students?
I think partly the experiences of victims when they approach generalist frontline services like child safety, for example, like police, or then in the next instance within the justice system, courts, where the experiences of victims seem to improve with the increasing level of knowledge and skills amongst the practitioners that they actually come across in their help-seeking process. I think also understanding that those frontline generalist services are what most victims come across first, because it's what we know that's out there. And then depending on how those responses are, and I think that's where the link between research and practice and training and knowledge building is really important. Depending on what those initial help-seeking contexts are, they can have a deterrent effect on engaging further with any type of support, disclosure. If that initial contact doesn't get the desired outcome, protection, support, empathy, whatever it might be, and that from the research I've done, the outcomes around actually being able to manage and establish safety for victims and their children. Again, seems to be better equipped with knowledge and skills the frontline workers are. It often seems to be more effective when victims come in contact with specialist services. But the problem is that a lot of them don't get there unless they've gone, unless they happen to have somebody who points them in the right direction, or unless they've gone through the generalist services who've made a concerted effort, or either part of an integrated response, for example, that works really well, or even where the region doesn't have an integrated response, where the generalist services know their service landscape and they know where to refer victims as well as perpetrators. And I think that's one of the things that I've covered extensively with students in the different areas.
Knowledge of the systems.
Yes.
And
if you can't do it, know who else can and what the referral
And it's knowledge of the system, and it's developing that capacity for compassion, isn't it? Because this is core to relational respect and that sort of thing. So and because as you're talking, I'm thinking the potential for people getting worn out in this field and as we say, burnt out. But I think having a balance between knowledge and the practical experience. Can develop this notion of compassion. I think of compassion as a combination of empathy and reason. Empathy, if you like, or that visceral experience of being in the work, and then balancing that with the reason of the knowledge, of understanding of the systems and the services. So that if you're spending your time in the shoes of someone else, which we have to do, I think, as part of the practice and the research. To be in the shoes of somebody else and to feel the world from that person's point of view, who've been through some very difficult experiences often, but to be able to balance that with some reason too, I think helps keep people in the field, keeps them motivated, keeps them well in the field, because we've got to think about health and safety of the people who work in the field too.
The other thing that I was just thinking, listening to you, Andrew, was that you and I both have the advantage of having come from a practitioner social work background, moved into academia and research in a very applied area, and are now teaching practitioners on the ground, because I think it's very beneficial being able to understand, having worked, having worked with perpetrators, me having worked with, intensive family support services and victim support service, and kind of understanding the challenges that practitioners face in various areas, whether it's within a service agreement, a legislative or policy framework, or within the knowledge base and the training they have, and be able to translate that into better training. And
it's good to hear you say that, because and I can see as in the process of having this discussion, the kind of relationship that we can have as teachers and researchers and practitioners in this field. And I think the modelling of those kind of relationships is really important, and the kind of playing out of those relationships, because it is a field, again, which is potentially has a lot of contention, a lot of conflict within it. And I think if we can see our worlds connecting, you're coming from one set of experience, my coming from another, and see those experiences as complementary, as dovetailing, rather than being against each other.
That's great. So you both covered some very interesting ideas here, because I think in the field and in my meetings and working with services, there is sometimes a perception that we've done enough research, that we know enough to get on and do things. But I think what you both nicely illustrate is that it is a continuous process of improvement. It's a continuous process of attempting to match.
We're always striving to do better,
to match our service approach. In the best possible way, and that there are always learnings, and learnings from research participants and from clients that then go on to inform what we teach and what
they're reinvested.
Yes. But I guess that illustrates very nicely too the core sort of principle that underpins the Centre for Domestic and Family Violence research, which is very much around this research into practice interface. And what you're both describing is a bridge, if you like. The programs, the education programs, provide that bridge between the research and practice.
Absolutely.
So you were going to say something?
No, I was just, as you were saying that there's always this need for ongoing in the interchange, the ongoing nature of research, and then the interchange.
Continuous improvement.
Because as I was just preparing a lecture in the child safety and intersection with domestic violence area, looking at the legislations that you mentioned earlier was exactly what I was looking at last night, in terms of having looked at the body of research that initially informed why we saw policies tightening up around seeing exposure to domestic and family violence of children as a form of child maltreatment, and then tightening policies that in the end were rather alienating and punitive towards mothers, and with the ongoing research then really being able to identify the unintended consequences, like the policies and legislation changes initially were well intended in terms of the right and the protection of the child, but came with a whole lot of unintended consequences that, and I think that's where it then illustrates with the research actually looking into that informed further policy reforms to actually look at children and the non-abusive parent as a package rather than treating the child as one.
That's right.
So I think it's a good example of where, we need that ongoing research to learn from first-hand experiences of victims, of perpetrators, of children, of practitioners, of indigenous communities. What works, what doesn't work, what have we implemented, what have we learned from those implementations, and how do we need to continue to shape and tailor them to actually meet the needs of the people affected from a practitioner as well as a family perspective on the ground.
Which brings in to practice, research, the next layer, which is policy.
Yeah,
yes. Very important layer of policy.
Yeah. Which is great, and our discussion today has sort of, one might say, has kind of worked its way upwards to finish up. Perhaps this is a nice place to finish our discussion today, because the influence on policy and on wider public thinking, around some of these important issues is another, critical outcome, isn't it? And certainly in the way that you described it, of this, of this sort of research, practice, education, and then policy. Yeah. Well, thank you both very much for spending your time today and chatting with us, and I think it's very nicely helped to explain to those who've kind of looked on at what the centre is doing, to understand, the purpose that sits behind that.
I hope so. Yeah. It's been an enlightening process for me too. I've learned a lot just in the talk.